You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Now, English schools should apparently be more like East Asian ones. That's the view of the UK's Education Secretary, who says children should spend more hours at school each day and have shorter holidays. Primary and secondary state schools in England currently finish at around 3:30 p.m. But Michael Gove recently told an education conference that the current system in England is outdated and doesn't fit in with modern family life. With me to discuss whether the school days should be longer and the summer holidays shorter is writer for the Sunday Telegraph, Jake Wallace-Simons, Lynn Burnham from campaign group Mothers at Home Matter, Conservative Member of Parliament and former Minister of Education Tim Lawton, and Jerry Glazier from the National Union of Teachers. We've all heard Michael Gove's recent comments, and I'm going to start perhaps with you, Lynn Burnham from the Mothers at Home Matter campaign group. What was your response to Michael Gove's suggestion of a longer day and shorter holidays?
Incredulity, actually. I could not believe that he thought that by extending the school day and by shortening the school holidays, that would improve the well-being of children in our schools. Children have a certain capacity to learn, and that doesn't equate to being an adult. Children need to have downtime at the end of a school day. If your child finishes at 4:30, 5 o'clock, if that child goes to a club after school, they come home, they have their meal, they go to bed. The government just does not want to have to let the children have time with their parents.
So you think it's a more anti-family message than it is a sort of educational message?
It's most definitely an anti-family message.
I suppose I'll ask you, Jerry Glazier from the National Union of Teachers, anti-family or just anti-state education as it stands?
Well, I agree with what Lynn says. I think she's absolutely right. I think it's quite wrong of Michael Gove to try and impose a different cultural perspective on education provision in this country. He's citing, as you said, Asian countries for that. From the National Union of Teachers, we are concerned about the impact of this change on the family, on the children, on their work-life balance, but equally we're very concerned about the work-life balance of teachers. On average, during the term time, teachers are working in excess of 50 hours a week. Only a third of those are actually teaching children. We think that balance is quite wrong. But there are enormous demands on teachers in terms of planning and preparation and marking and responding to government initiatives and developments, etc. What Michael Gove is seeking to do is to get teachers to work even longer, and we think that would be very prejudicial to the teaching profession. It will certainly make the teaching profession less attractive and could result in significant future problems with teacher supply.
Is there any argument, though, that the longer teaching day and shorter holidays will benefit the modern family, to parents who are working? I'm going to ask the writer for the Sunday Telegraph here, Jake Wallace-Simons.
Well, I mean, I think that what we've heard is an example of people telling our children, you can't manage long hours, you can't manage serious academic subjects, you've got to take care of your capacity and your well-being and so forth. And that's the message that we've been seeing for the past 10 years, which have seen our schools under the Labour government in particular sliding down the international league tables dramatically. In the year 2000, we came into the league tables with reading we were 7th in the world for reading. That's come down to 25th. Science has come down from 4th to 16th. Maths from 8th to 28th. And we can see that in East Asian countries, they're not telling children you can't manage. They're telling them you can. Their expectations are higher. And what they're getting out of their children is much higher as well. I mean, in Singapore, for example, 4 out of 5 children get the equivalent of an A to C grade in English and Maths, whereas here it's only half of children. And I think that we're actually doing children a disservice if we focus on what they can't manage, rather than looking at their potential and telling them what they can do, and we can see this reflected throughout society.
I'm just going to come to you now, former Minister of Education Tim Lawton and Conservative Member of Parliament, just to get your thoughts before we then embark on the rest of the discussion, because would you agree that the English system needs to come in line with the East Asian one?
Well, I think the English system needs to catch up with the 21st century. Many of the hours, and particularly the way the holidays pan out in the UK, is a result of when we had a large part of our population working in agriculture and they had long holidays over the summer to bring in the harvest. We are in a completely different environment now. We have families which take very different forms, and I certainly disagree, I'm afraid, with Lynn. This isn't about being anti-family at all. This is partly about adapting to the way families live their lifestyles and working practices, but it's also about competing in an international environment. And some of those statistics which Jake gave you are a wake-up call. We have slipped behind in the international tables, and those countries that are making most progress in the education achievement of their kids, and it's not just the Far East, there are certain East European countries as well that are doing much better, are those that have got more flexible and longer school times. And that's not just about intensive teaching times, it's about a lot of other things that happen within schools as well as part of their general well-being. But the fact of the matter is that this year, China and India alone will produce something like 1.2 million graduates in engineering alone, people that are going to be working for companies that produce stuff that we buy. That's what we've got to keep up with, and we've been slipping back, and so we've got to reform the way we teach in this country. We've got to make sure that kids are being stretched as much as possible and getting the very most out of schools, and adapting different teaching times, different school times has to be part of that process.
Jerry Glazier from the NUT, though, is there any suggestions that you would make then to improve the standard within schools without having to elongate hours or days there and shorten holidays?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that you need to be able to have the very best motivated teachers in schools, and I think some of the actions of this government over the last 2 years in particular have done the opposite, and the Secretary of State is seeking to deregulate pay, to worsen conditions. So unless we can recruit and significantly retain the very best teachers, that is going to have a negative impact, and a much more serious impact on pupils than anything else that I can think about. It is important that students are motivated. It's important that the curriculum is relevant, and it needs to change. We'll be continuing debates about how that does change, and we need to ensure that students have outcomes which allow them to make decisions which are best for their future. But we're talking now about the environment in which children learn, and we're talking about this country. And I think it's really wrong to look at other countries because, as I said earlier, the cultural differences are significant. I'm not particularly familiar about Singapore, but I know it's a relatively small island, and I don't know what the circumstances are there. But whether it's relevant to just overlay these principles in this country, I don't believe so. Tim refers to the agricultural pattern of the school holidays. That is true, but we have not had a significant agricultural influence in this country for many, many years, yet the pattern has retained because most people believe it's a sensible pattern. It has a balance in it, and having the longer summer holidays allows teachers to recharge their batteries, to have a bit of holiday. It creates a distinctive difference between the start of the new academic year, and it does allow families to get together. I think what's behind this, of course, is the austerity cuts which are impacting on local authorities, and it's not allowing as many play schemes to be put on in the holiday period. And it seems to me that the Secretary of State wants to put that responsibility onto schools. Schools are for education, not for childminding.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and we're discussing Britain's Education Secretary's proposals to make school days longer and holidays shorter. Lynn Burnham is from Mothers at Home Matter.
If shorter holidays were more beneficial for school-aged children, why doesn't the private school sector reduce the number of holidays they have? I mean, this is complete nonsense, utter nonsense. Gove offered no evidence to support his claim that the change would improve standards. He said it would make life easier for working parents and it would be family-friendly. Now we are really getting to the heart of the matter when he says that. Another ploy is to ensure both parents work for as many hours as they can. This proposal is another state stronghold on the family. We should resist it at all cost for the sake of our children.
I mean, you mentioned here, Jake, that it was you relayed some statistics about how the English schools fare amongst other schools globally, mentioning Singapore, and we've got another aspect to this, which is the Gove suggests it's keeping it in line with modern day living. But which argument is it, and which one will win? Is it to keep schools in line with the two-parent working family, or is it so that England can compete on a global scale?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, to pick up Lynn's point about private schools, it may be true what you said about private schools having longer holidays, but at the same time, private schools have on average 1.45 hours per day longer at school. So I think it's worth putting it in the broader picture. Mr. Glazier said that it's wrong to look at other countries and we should instead somehow just assess ourselves on our own merits. Unfortunately, we live in a globalised world that's not good enough anymore. That head in the sand approach is what's seen us falling behind in the league tables. And unfortunately, either we start to work like the Chinese or we start to work for them, as somebody once said. Nobody is saying that we have to completely imitate the Chinese system or the Singaporean system or whatever. We'll do it in our own way. But at the same time, at the moment we get 6 weeks, the children get 6 weeks off in the summer. Changing that to 4 weeks, I think, will still allow them downtime, still allow them to have a good, play in the woods or do outings with their families, with their parents or whatever. But at the same time, we'll give them more time at school, which they need, particularly poorer children. Poorer children tend to backslide more during the longer holidays than more wealthier children. So I think that these measures, there's been a lot of hysteria about it. Gove isn't talking about abolishing holidays completely or turning ourselves into China, but he's saying that we need to really address what's going wrong.
But then you can't just talk about the children having longer days and shorter holidays. What about the teachers? These teachers often work from 8 in the morning to 6:30 at night. Most half terms are spent writing reports or preparing for parents' night, and in the summer it's planning for the next term. When do teachers get a break? I suppose, Jerry Glazier, you should come in at this point.
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. Can I just make the point that Jake made? This learning loss argument that he referred to, that students forget what they've learned during long holidays, there is really no substantial evidence to back that up. And it's the first time I've heard that poorer kids have a greater learning loss. I'd like to know what the evidence is for that. I agree with him. We should be talking empirically about things, not emotionally. In terms of the balance, it is important. I think the job of teaching is an enormously stressful job, and I hear far too many teachers working far too many hours now, and that's having a very negative impact on their work-life balance and in many cases on their health. We're seeing too many teachers leaving the profession early at a time in their 50s when the government wants teachers to continue working well into their late 60s in the future. So I think we need to be very careful about what demands we put on teachers and what expectations there are. And what I don't see in Gove's proposal is any quid pro quo. He's simply saying that he wants schools to be in session longer and children to have greater access to learning, but he doesn't seem to want to recognise the consequences of that. There's nothing wrong in schools being able to open longer if they've got the requisite amount of staffing to do that without putting the demands on the existing staff. I think most people would agree that schools need to be part and at the heart of the community and contributing more positively to that community, but they need to have the resources and the staffing to enable them to do that. And this is not part of Mr. Gove's plans, I'm afraid.
Tim Lawton, then, what would your response be if perhaps there were suggestions that parliamentary recess should be shorter to bring it in line with modern life?
Most MPs' jobs are 365 days a year. I have 91,000 constituents who expect me to be there and available, quite rightly, 365 days a year. The amount of time we actually spend in the chamber of the House of Commons is a very, very small part of our job. But I agree with Jerry's point about teachers. Of course, the most important part of education apart from the children, has to be the teachers. They are our most precious resource, and we need to continue to improve the quality of our teachers, the enthusiasm of people coming into the teaching profession, and lots of things are going on to do that. But at the end of the day, we have got to do what is best for the kids. They need to be stretched, and I'm afraid it's just completely backward-looking to say we are wrong to look at what's going on in other countries. If we don't do that, we will continue to slide down the scale, and we will not have kids coming out of our schools suitably qualified to be able to compete in a modern world. And within the next 20 years or so, there will be fewer than 500,000 unskilled jobs available in the UK. If we don't make sure our kids succeed more at school, are taught the right things in the right way, then we are just going to have an awful lot of young people who are just not employable by companies in this country. And I think if you look at what has been happening somebody raised the independent sector, and actually some of these flexibilities, which is what we need in the system, have been available since 2011, where schools can change the hours that they sit. And some of the most successful schools, particularly those who have changed to academies, have actually brought in longer working hours. They're the ones that are seeing the biggest increases in the achievements and outcomes for their kids. They're actually the schools that are seeing the biggest number of good teachers apply for jobs there as well. And the biggest scandal we've got in education in the UK today is the huge gap in achievement between those kids who are able to go to independent schools and those who are in the maintained sector. And we need to learn some tricks from the practices in the independent sector, where they tend to have longer hours, teaching, but a whole host of other complementary activities as well. And they achieve better in their qualifications. And we need to share that best practice in the maintained sector so more kids can take advantage of that as well. And this is just one element of doing that.
But they also have longer summer holidays as well.
They have longer summer holidays, but that's because they work very much longer hours during the week.
But you've just held up academies as an example of schools doing well that are already doing longer days, but those aren't the schools that are going to be having longer summer holidays.
Well, that's up to them, because the whole thrust of what the government is trying to do is to get ministers, bureaucrats, Department for Education out of the hair of good schools and good head teachers, so that they can decide what is best for their pupils locally in terms of school hours, in terms of how they adapt the curriculum, how they spend their resources. Now, far more independence than ever before is being given to schools to make the right call, and we need to trust teachers, particularly if we're getting increasingly good teachers in, good leaders, to be able to decide what is best at their school for their pupils. And if they want to adapt the way the school week works, then we should let them do that and not be afraid of doing so. And actually, just to pick up a final point. Jake said that some of the kids who will benefit most for this are some of those who need to catch up. And that's why this government's put a lot of extra money into the pupil premium. So those kids from more deprived backgrounds, for whom there's been this culture of mediocrity, a real poverty of ambition, I'm afraid the NET is just displayed again here, we've given those extra resources so they can get that extra help during the school time, out of school time as well, to make sure they can compete on a level playing field with all the other kids in the school as well. And that's got to be a good thing. And again, flexibility about school hours.
That was a final point. I'm going to, before I come back to you, Jerry Glazer, because I did hear you interject there from the NET, I do want to speak to Lynn Burnham, hear from Lynn Burnham from Others at Home Matter, who's been desperate.
Yes, I have. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat. Yes, everyone's comparing the child numbers here with the children in Asia, in India, in China. Let's get a little bit closer to home, shall we? Finnish children. Now, Finland is a country that everybody's supposed to look up to. It's supposed to have one of the highest education levels in the world, not just in Europe, but in the world. Finnish children receive 777 hours of education per annum. In the UK, it's 925 hours as we stand today. Japan and Korea, which also happen to be in Asia and are supposed to be forward-thinking countries, have 868 and 867 hours of teaching per year. So are we all going to become like robots? Is that the way? Do people want to take the human element out of teaching?
I think Jake Simons, if you want to respond to Lynn's question about all becoming robots, looking at the statistics from East Asia.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure where those statistics have come from, but it seems as if Lynn and people who argue the same position as she does are trying to marshal everything they can to keep children where they are, which at the moment isn't in a particularly good place with respect to the rest of the world. They're trying to argue that children should be doing less work, should have more time at home, longer holidays, and shouldn't be stretched, and we shouldn't be expecting them to really perform better than they're doing at the moment. There's a sort of, I mean, Tim used the phrase poverty of ambition. I think that's quite a good one. I think it's worth actually turning to America. Over the last 20 years, they've had some interesting developments over there, where about 2 decades ago, the Nobel laureate James Heckman did some research where he found that life success overall depended not so much on academic qualifications, but on what he called grit and character. Which were things like self-control, resourcefulness, resilience, determination, self-belief, conscientiousness, perseverance, those sorts of things. I think that we really do need to focus on stretching children, expecting more of them and telling them that we believe in them, that they can do more, they can achieve. I used to live in Taiwan, in Asia, and I can just see the difference in attitude towards children over there. They expect more, and that in turn, I mean, it's got a downside where they can push children too far, the tiger mother syndrome. But by and large, children know that that more is expected of them, and it gives them a greater degree of confidence to excel.
Do you think then, Jerry Glazer, NUT, that teachers aren't expecting enough from children?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question because I was quite offended by Tim Loughton's description of the NUT having a poverty of ambition. That is absolutely outrageous. The NUT is committed to ensuring we have the very best trained and best motivated teachers in this country, and we think it's absolutely important that teachers do have a high status and the profession is well rewarded and well recognised, so we can attract teachers to the profession to give all kids in this country the very best opportunities. I agree with him that the pupil premium is an initiative which we fought for in detail for a long time, to give additional resources to those pupils in challenging areas to help compensate for all the other things which are an explanation of why they don't progress as well as they do. And at the moment we've got some big challenges in this country. Poverty levels are increasing. Access to education will be affected from that. What's interesting about the independent schools, of course, is they have much smaller classes, and we've been campaigning and continue to campaign for smaller classes. Class sizes in this country are getting bigger and bigger, and that will impact negatively on educational opportunities. So we need to be rational. We need to look at the real statistics, not the emotional responses. And, I don't think it's helpful to cite some academies. There's been some academies which have been spectacular failures, Tim, as you know. So school structures aren't always the answer. What's important is that we reflect the needs of the kids, we motivate the kids, we keep an eye on the needs of society and the needs of the country going forward, but we get the balance right. That's crucially important. Teachers are in the business of teaching because they are committed to the vocation of teaching. You can't teach unless you understand what vocation's about. Well, you can't teach well, in my view. So that is a very important point. What we need to do is to ensure that teachers are trusted, as Tim said, and I think there's precious little evidence that this government trusts teachers. It's one of the things I asked Michael Gove some while ago. How are you going to demonstrate you trust teachers? Teachers do need to be trusted. They need to be allowed professionalism. They need to be allowed to get on with their job. They don't want to be micromanaged by the Secretary of State in Whitehall. We need to get the balance right there. We need to show that teachers are trusted, and I think that will help the profession to become respected. But they need to be unfettered in a way which allows them to get on with the job in a positive and constructive way. They need to be properly supported with high quality in-service training. Those sort of things will make the difference. But at the moment, the government is seeking to downgrade their pay and interfere with their conditions. And this is just another example of it. So I think whatever Michael Gove's laudable intentions were in making the announcement he did last week, he's actually got it 100% wrong. And I think it's significant that there are very few people across the political spectrum that support his proposals.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and we're discussing whether the school day should be made longer and the summer holidays shorter. I'm joined by Sunday Telegraph journalist Jake Wallace-Simons, Conservative Member of Parliament and former Minister of Education Tim Lawton, Jerry Glazier from the National Union of Teachers, and Lynn Burnham from campaign group Mothers at Home Matter. In terms of Mothers at Home Matter, some families are forced to have two parents that are working. Would this not help them in some way?
Of course it would help those parents that are working. But if you look at a Mumsnet survey that was done not very long ago, just a few months ago, 78% of all mums questioned on Mumsnet said that they would rather be at home, or at least they would rather down the number of hours that they were working. Most mothers, if given the choice, would rather have that flexibility. They would rather not be in the workplace 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And if I can just add in, because I know that we're probably running out of time, to have every moment regulated and audited is destructive to everything which makes us human. Children need to be children. And if you force more long school hours on them, long school days, shorter holidays, you're eroding their childhood.
What would your response be then, Jake Wallace-Simons, to an erosion of childhood in the school holidays by making the holidays shorter?
Well, I think that, in fact, the opposite is the case. I mean, the government isn't micromanaging children in this way. In fact, it was the Labour government who had this culture of targets and so forth, and part of that was certainly dumbing down the education system and expecting less of our children. I would say that I'm absolutely behind Lynn's campaign for Mothers at Home Matter, particularly in the early years. The government definitely needs to recognise the importance of mothers being at home in the preschool years, the ages of 1 to 3, 1 to 5. That's really of vital importance. The taxation system isn't recognising that enough at the moment. And similarly, the NUT, Mr. Glazier talked about teachers' conditions, and my wife is a teacher in the state school system, and the amount of marking that she has to do is quite atrocious. I would look forward to seeing that being reduced. But at the same time, I think that we need to be thinking in terms of how we can stretch children, get the most out of them, give them the ambition to really succeed on a world stage, telling them that we believe in them and we believe that their horizons can be whatever they wish it to be, and stop limiting them by saying you can only manage a short day. You've only got this reduced capacity. You need to be a child and run out in the trees. They're going to still have their holidays. They're going to still be able to do that. But we just need to believe in our children more and stop limiting them and limiting ourselves.
Well, we are towards the end of this discussion, so I think I suppose I'll have a final word from you, Jerry Glazier from the NUT.
It's important that everybody understands that the vast majority of teachers are working excessive hours already, are very committed. They want to do the best. They're frustrated that they're being constrained far too much with a lot of bureaucratic burdens which are being ironically increasingly imposed upon them by a government that seems to be committed to deregulation. It's actually going to have the opposite effect of what's intended. But at the end of the day, I think we need to be working together to ensure that we attract the very best teachers to the profession, that we can keep them there, and that we do have a job which is valued by society and one which is manageable, so that we can ensure that all teachers do the very best for all children in very different circumstances.
That was Jerry Glazier from the National Union of Teachers. Also taking part in the discussion was Sunday Telegraph journalist Jake Wallace-Simons, Conservative Member of Parliament Tim Lawton, and Lynn Burnham from campaign group Mothers at Home Matter. Thanks to all my guests for joining me, Juliet Spare, on The Voice of Russia in London. Teachers, anti-family or just anti-state education as it stands?
Well, I agree with what Lynn says. I think she's absolutely right. I think it's quite wrong of Michael Gove to try and impose a different cultural perspective on education provision in this country. He's citing, as you said, Asian countries for that. From the National Union of Teachers, we are concerned about the impact of this change on the family, on the children, on their work-life balance, but equally we're very concerned about the work-life balance of teachers.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Now, English schools should apparently be more like East Asian ones. That's the view of the UK's Education Secretary, who says children should spend more hours at school each day and have shorter holidays. Primary and secondary state schools in England currently finish at around 3:30 p.m.
Children need to have downtime at the end of a school day. If your child finishes at 4:30, 5 o'clock, if that child goes to a club after school, they come home, they have their meal, they go to bed. The government just does not want to have to let the children have time with their parents.
So you think it's a more anti-family message than it is a sort of educational message?
It's most definitely an anti-family message.
I suppose I'll ask you, Jerry Glazier, from the National Union of Lynn Burnham from the Mothers at Home Matter campaign group. What was your response to Michael Gove's suggestion of a longer day and shorter holidays?
Incredulity, actually. I could not believe that he thought that by extending the school day and by shortening the school holidays, that would improve the well-being of children in our schools. Children have a certain capacity to learn, and that doesn't equate to being an adult.
But Michael Gove recently told an education conference that the current system in England is outdated and doesn't fit in with modern family life. With me to discuss whether the school days should be longer and the summer holidays shorter is writer for the Sunday Telegraph, Jake Wallace-Simons, Lynn Burnham from campaign group Mothers at Home Matter, Conservative Member of Parliament and former Minister of Education Tim Lawton, and Jerry Glazier from the National Union of Teachers. We've all heard Michael Gove's recent comments, and I'm going to start perhaps with you.